two, one. How you doing? Good morning. Good morning. How y'all doing out there? This is another great episode of the Sean P. Experience, sitting with the Griots, where I have a chance to sit down with some of the best story writers in the country, man. And today is no exception. I have the amazing author, Mr. Larry Ty. How you doing this morning?
I'm doing well. I'm glad to be with you this morning.
Yes, sir. The blessing is totally mine. To give a little backdrop for the audience and yourself, in 2022, BET came out with a series called The Porters, and it really captivated me. I've been on a Pullman Porter trail ever since. Your book, Rising from the Rest, the first thing I picked up when it comes to the Pullman Porters, and so many people I talked about this topic with in the past 2 years, and surprisingly, not many people know about the Pullman Porters, man. So I've been wanting to talk to you and had this moment for 2 years, to sit down and talk about it a little bit more in depth. So that's kind of my backstory to how we got here today, sir.
Great. So it's a good backstory, and I'm glad to be here to talk about my friends, the Pullman Porters.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. So this book is 20 years old. I realized that looking at the copyright date. This book is 20 years old. So how does it feel reaching the 20-year mark with this publication? And furthermore, how did it feel whenever I emailed you, like, you know what? I want to sit down and talk about this book 20 years
So
later.
I
It
want
still
to
has
hold
me.
up another book 20 years later, and this is the
Yeah.
Pullman Porters are to me the gift that keeps on giving. They
Wow.
gave me the gift of telling their story 20 years ago when I was doing that book. There were probably 40 or 50 Pullman Porters alive. By the time the
Mm.
book came out a year and a half later, there were half that number, and today there are none. But the Pullman Porters made me promise that someday I would write two other books. One was a book on their favorite athlete that they carried on the trains, and that was a guy named Satchel Paige. And
Yes.
about 8 or 9 years ago, I wrote a biography of Satchel Paige. And
Yes.
the other was a book on their three favorite passengers, who were three guys named Ellington, Armstrong, and Basie. And I ended up writing a book that just came out about Duke Ellington, Louis Armstrong, and Count Basie.
Yes,
And
sir. Yes, sir.
if I could take a minute and tell you why the Pullman Porters cared so much about these three guys, because
Yes, sir.
I think it says something about the Porters, about the band leaders, and about America. And that is because whenever these Pullman Porters were going down south below the Mason Dixon line in the 1930s or 1940s or up into the 50s and 60s, if they picked the wrong restaurant to try to get a meal or the wrong hotel to try to book a room, they could be berated, they could be beaten up, or they could actually end up at the end of a lynching noose. And so, what
Mm.
they did, the only way in that Jim Crow America to be safe was they rented private Pullman sleeping cars, took them down south with them, and when they would go in to perform a concert somewhere like Atlanta, they knew that at the end of the night, when they were looking for somewhere to have a good meal, there would be a great meal waiting for them in the dining car. When they were looking for a comfortable bed to sleep in, there would be a plush bed made up by the Pullman porters. And most importantly, when they were looking for somewhere they could be safe, the Pullman sleeping car gave them that place. And so, what they did in return for the Pullman porters was in the middle of the night, they would perform a private concert in the closed capsule of that railroad car with just the porters and the dining car guys as their audience. And I don't know about you, Sean, but if I could go back to any moment in history, it would be a pretty good time to pick one of those Pullman sleeping cars and get the Duke Ellington Orchestra playing
Yes.
just for me.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Wow, that's a powerful, incredible story you just told, man. That's amazing right there, sir. That is amazing, right? So I'm gonna give you a formal introduction before we take off with the whole show, right? So for the
Great.
audience watching that don't know, we have the author Larry Ty is an American nonfiction author and journalist known for his biographies of notable Americans such as Edward Bernays, Statue Page, Robert F. Kennedy, and Joseph McCarthy. Ty was a reporter for the Boston Globe, where his primary beat was medicine. Ty was a Nieman Fellow at Harvard University in 1993 through 1991, has won a series of major newspaper awards, including the Livingston Award for Young Journalists and the Edward J. Meeman Award for Environmental Journalists. And two of Ty's books have been adopted in the documentary films. I watched the Rising the Rails documentary last night. I highly suggest it.
Great. Nice introduction.
Thank you very much, sir. Thank you very much. So my next thing is you start the book off by saying the Pullman Porters were the most influential black men in the country at this time. Tell us a little bit about why these guys were the most influential, not doctors, not lawyers, not athletes. These guys were the most influential black men in America at that time.
So they were for a number of reasons. One is because they got to see the country in a way that no black men got to do in that time. They were traveling perpetually across the country, and when they were in between runs working on the sleeping cars, they got to visit places that people just didn't get to go if their skin was black in that era. And we're talking about the era from the end of the Civil War for 100 years until the 1960s. A second reason was they made more money than blacks in any profession then. The expression used to be in a later era, the two best jobs in black America were Pullman and Postal, meaning the first federal agency that integrated, which was the Postal Service and the Pullman Porters. The third reason was that even as they were traveling the country and working really hard on those trips, their ears and their eyes were open. They were listening to people like Rockefellers and Carnegies who were riding the Pullman sleeping cars. They got everything from stock tips to ideas on the importance of education, and they came back and put their money and their ideas to work in ensuring that the next generations got educations and got exposure to the way things really worked in America. And in my research, I found that I could very seldom find somebody prominent in the black world, whether it was a scientist or a political figure, a person of of monetary, financial influence, or people who were doctors and lawyers and the kinds of people you were just talking about. It was very seldom that I would find one that didn't have a grandfather or a father, an uncle, or somebody who was a Pullman porter. And that ranged from people like Thurgood Marshall, whose father was a train porter, to Michelle Obama, whose great grandfather was a porter. And there were just
Wow.
it was not accidental. There were very few Pullman porters compared to other professions, the professions that people generally look to as having spawned that kind of influence were ministers and teachers, and there were a lot more of them. But the Pullman porters had more money than ministers or teachers, and they had more of a sense of how the whole country operated. And these guys had a disproportionate influence. And
Mm,
I keep looking when I test out that theory with people who are a whole lot smarter than me. I keep waiting for somebody to contradict it and say, no, you're wrong. And everybody seems to agree that these Pullman porters are an untold story of the
mhm.
Jim Crow era and an untold story of Black triumph in America.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Let me ask you a question. You mentioned, but they had to be invisible almost. That was a part of their job is to
Yep.
be invisible, to go without speaking sometimes. Do you think that part of it is kind of sort of a reason why they're not as talked about as often? Is a part of the situation?
Yes. So their invisibility was when you were doing long trips across the country where people could be for 4 or 5 nights on the train and maybe end up one of those nights in a berth of somebody who they weren't related to and shouldn't have been in a berth of. You wanted people who knew how to be diplomatic, who wouldn't whisper, and who knew how to keep their mouths shut. And Pullman porters were expert at that. I think that they were used to operating, as you're suggesting, under the surface in a very subtle way. And they were definitely not used to telling their story, as I found out when I interviewed them. The reason I'm convinced the Pullman porters talked to me, and just about everyone I could dig up did talk to me, was not because they thought I was so terrific. It was that partly they were getting old and they didn't want to go to their graves without having told their story,
Yes,
and
sir.
partly that they had not told their own human compelling stories even to their kids and grandkids because they were so used to being understated and closed mouth. And I think that it was only through people like me who had big mouths and through people who became very prominent in American history, like A. Philip Randolph, the head of the
Yeah.
Pullman Porters Union, that their story got out there and was told to a wider audience.
And I'm glad you went to that direction because my next question was going to ask you. In the introduction, you mentioned at a certain point feeling like I don't know if I deserve to tell this story for these black men. And then
Yep,
your next line was you was there. At least you were there. And
exactly. So I was
yeah,
there. I'm an old white guy, and did I deserve? I was a little less old of a guy when I was telling the story, but did I deserve to be telling their story? And the answer is partly what you just said, that I was there. The other answer was that these guys had spent their lives, much like Satchel Paige and the three musicians that I wrote about, Ellington, Armstrong, and Basie, to try to have a society that didn't recognize color. And the idea, whether I was white or black or brown or green, I don't think mattered to these guys. What mattered is I was there, I wanted to tell their story, and they had to trust me. And I hope I lived up to their trust, but they had to trust me to get it right because they didn't have any choice. I was the one guy who was there, and they were getting very old.
yes, sir. Yes, sir. I love to ask. I love research questions. I want to ask you a very unique research question. So I did listen to your Satchel Paige book, and Satchel Paige is known for embellishing, adding on to a story. So whenever you're
Yes.
sitting down interviewing these porters, and of course it's been years since that time, how do you decide when something is like fact versus fiction, or how do you decide when something's kind of being beefed up, if you will?
So that's a very good question. And the answer is it's a lot easier to do it with the Pullman Porters because they were a lot less likely to embellish than it was
Okay.
Satchel Paige. But on the other hand, with Satchel Paige, it's with everybody you write about. When you write about Bobby Kennedy, did all the things he claimed for himself and all the things people who thought he was a hero, were all those things really true? And the answer was most of them were true, but some of them weren't. And you had to point out what wasn't true, even when you were writing about your hero. And with Joe McCarthy, who was a pretty evil guy, um, I wanted to see whether all the bad things that people said about him were true, and some of those bad things weren't true. And unless you're finding out things that defy your expectation, you're not looking deep enough and asking the right questions. So with Satchel Paige, his numbers that he claimed were incredible and would have set new records for everything from no hitters pitched to shutouts to total number of games and number of batters he faced and everything else. And yet, I found in the end that even when I thought he was embellishing, that he only played around with things where he was having good fun. He played around with his date of birth. Every new reporter who talked to him, he gave a new birthday because that didn't matter and that was his personal story. But when it came to what he did on the baseball diamond, in the end, I concluded that he at times underestimated his accomplishments, and that if we went back and had a record of every game that he pitched, that his records would have been even more extraordinary. And that was shocking to me, and yet it was encouraging that this guy, who everybody thought was a really good pitcher, but a great storyteller and maybe a bit of a fibber, was in fact more of a truth teller because he knew that if he lied about things that mattered to him as deeply as how many games he pitched and how many no hitters he pitched, that nobody would ever believe him in anything else. And so he
Mm,
understated it. And it
wow.
is one of the sad aspects of Negro League baseball that they didn't have reporters there at every ball game recording what happened. And so we've lost a lot of the records. And one of
Yes,
the
sir.
things that's just happened is Major League Baseball just decided to include in its record books all the records that we could confirm. And I'm convinced there was a recent death of a guy who might have been the all time greatest all round baseball player ever, Willie Mays. And
Really
he
made. That's right.
exactly. So every story talked about how he had 660, I think it was, home runs and all the different things that he accomplished. I'm convinced if we went back and looked at the couple of years that he pitched in the Negro Leagues, his records would be even more phenomenal because those were in the prime of his life when he was a young, talented baseball player who wasn't allowed to pitch, wasn't allowed to play in the major leagues. And if we added in all of those other records when he was playing at a major league like level of competition, his records would be even more astounding.
And I'm glad you said that. I planned on asking you about the major league records toward the end of the interview, but let's do it right now.
Right.
I want to ask you how you feel about that because you wrote the Satchel Paige book years ago. So how do you feel about
Mm.
that currently with these current changes and stuff and records? How do you feel?
So without being crude, I feel like it's damn well about time that this happened. And it should have happened. There should never have been a Negro Leagues. It should have been all great baseball players playing against one another. Satchel Paige helped demonstrate when he would do barnstorming tours across America against the leading white baseball teams led by Bob Feller and before that by Dizzy Dean. He proved that black ball players could win more than their share of ball games against the best of white baseball. And the idea that now, you know, 150 years after the Civil War that we're finally getting around to saying, geez, maybe these black baseball players' records should be included as part of making up for this tragedy of having segregated baseball. I just say it's about time, and I just wish it had happened when Satchel Paige and all the other great Negro leaguers from Josh Gibson to Cool
That's
Papa
good.
Bell were still around and could have enjoyed it and gotten the notoriety that they deserved.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Um, you mentioned how much research you did for the Pullman Porters, how much countless hours of research and digging in files and everything. I know that everything can't make it into the book. So, what's something that you wish would have made it into the book that's not?
So what I wished was that I had written either a second book or included enough in that book that it was a biography of A. Philip Randolph as well as of the Pullman Porters. And I had to limit what I could say about Randolph because there were all these Pullman Porters that I wanted to talk about. But I think that if Martin Luther King is rightfully considered the father of civil rights in America, that A. Philip Randolph was the grandfather. And no Randolph, one could argue, no King. And it was the Pullman Porters who elevated Martin Luther King to his position of leadership in the first critical battleground, the Montgomery bus boycott. And it was, in fact, a guy behind the scenes named E.D. Nixon, a Pullman porter, who ran the Montgomery office of the NAACP and of the Pullman Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. He was the one who was running that bus boycott, but he was too busy being out on the road as a Pullman porter. So he found a smart young minister named Martin King who could be the front guy. And everything from their giving their money to support the civil rights movement when the movement had no money, to their giving their union halls to the civil rights movement. There's an incredible story there, and there's the story of A. Philip Randolph. And maybe you, Sean, or somebody smart's going to come along someday and write a brilliant biography on Randolph because he's the guy that was most elemental in
Yes,
launching a civil rights revolution and the one we know the least about.
yes, sir. I love how you gave a lot of his earlier battles trying to start different unions
Mm.
way before he did with the sleeping cars, and it showed you the background and all the tactics he learned along the way that led up to that moment. And it kind of was the perfect marriage in the time whenever that came across. That was incredible how you laid that out.
So it was the perfect marriage. He knew nothing about trains. He knew nothing about the life of a Pullman porter, but he didn't have to. He knew what made people tick. He knew what made union leadership resist union membership. And he knew how people like George Pullman and George Pullman's successor, a guy named Robert Todd Lincoln, the son of Abraham Lincoln, he knew just what tough sons of guns those guys were and how to break them. And I think that and he did it on behalf of these noble Pullman porters, and they idolized him in a way that nobody else in their world came close to, because they knew how he gave them not just money and better working conditions, but he gave them a dignity that came with having their own union.
Yes, sir. His early life, he and his brother, and they're down there in Florida. It reminded me a lot of reading about James Weldon Johnson and his brother. They sound, two incredible guys, and then the parents they had and the community they lived in. So much of it sounds so similar to those guys.
So it does, and it sounds similar to me to a lot of what happened with somebody like Duke Ellington, that people found a way, whether it was Satchel Paige or Louis Armstrong or the Pullman Porters and A. Philip Randolph, found a way to take this system of Jim Crow and not attack it head on, because they knew they would only butt their head in, but to take it on from the side and from under and from over and from any way they could infiltrate it, whether it was with music or the artistry of their pitching on a baseball mound, or by founding the first successful black trade union. They found the chinks in the armor of Jim Crow segregation, and they cracked away at them, and they ended up breaking it open in a way that nobody could have imagined. And that in that era, it was one thing for Martin Luther King to do it a generation later, but the idea that these guys were doing it before there was anything called a civil rights movement was pretty amazing.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. It was. Yes, it was. Um, Another one of my favorite topics the past 5 years is the black press. I love studying black press. So the Pullman porters, um, they were able to get all of these newspapers and everything from their passengers, and they embraced self education so much, and taking the time late at night to read these papers and bring them back to these communities. And the part I love the most, they'll wrap these papers up and throw them off the back of the train as they're passing through these communities. Speak about the importance of that drive of
Sure.
self determination that these
So,
guys displayed.
as a lifelong journalist, I have a bias towards the press having influence in a positive way if it wants to. And the two leading black newspapers in that era, every city of any size had a black newspaper, but the two best in the country were the Chicago Defender and the Pittsburgh Courier. And the editors of these newspapers both understood the role of the Pullman Porters, partly in having influence on the country, but also partly in being the only blacks who were traveling the whole country. So they would give them copies, especially of the Chicago Defender, as you said, wrapped up in brown paper wrapping. And that was so that the people in the communities in these small southern towns wouldn't get upset with blacks along the railroad tracks who picked up and read these newspapers, and nobody knew what they were getting because it was wrapped in plain brown paper. But they got the word out across America, not just that people had more rights in the North where there wasn't the Jim Crow system, but that there was a need for workers and that a better life was possible there. So the thing that we now refer to as the Great Migration was fueled in part by getting word out to blacks living in small towns across the South. And the way that word got out was through the couriers, like Pullman Porters, who were taking that word out. They were telling people about their life living in Chicago or Detroit or New York or Boston, and they were letting them read about it for themselves, and they were convincing. And that is also the way that jazz records of people like Ellington, Armstrong, and Basie, before they were available in record stores across America, the way the records got out was the Pullman Porters took them out with them and gave them out or sold them along the way. And that's how word got transmitted. And it was a brilliant informal network of couriers before there was a formal network or before there was anything called the internet that linked us all together.
Yes, sir. Whenever I run about that time frame, it seemed like there was a lot more black press than I would think there is in current day, in my opinion. What's your thoughts about that? It seemed like they had, like you said, thousands of black press. all around. It seemed like every major movement had their own press. You know, the Black
They
Panther
did.
Party, Marcus Garvey, Du Bois. Like every movement had their own press.
That was for two reasons, I think. One was because um, the everything in America was segregated, and if you were told there are separate drinking fountains for blacks and whites, and parks and libraries and schools, it was not surprising that the only way blacks were going to get equal treatment of their world in newspapers, which was the main source of the media back then, was by having their own newspapers. And so, no offense to papers like the Chicago Defender, which still exist, they exist as a shadow of what they were. The black press was better then, it was stronger, it was more widely read. And that's partly because we were a more segregated world, but it's also because, as you say, there were all these activist movements, and they didn't trust the mainstream press to get out word about what they were doing, so they put out that word themselves. And I think one of the many tragedies of the death of media in America is the death of black media in America. But you
Mm,
know, there is um, every day I read about the death of another newspaper, and it makes me want to cry.
yes, sir. Um, After reading your book and many other books like it, the past 2 years I try to make myself when I travel somewhere. Every city I go to, I get a different paper because these guys had 4 or 5 different papers they would read. And I want to kind of, even though we have the technology now, I still want to make sure I
Yeah.
get the old school stop and get an actual physical paper because those guys they value that. And then whenever I'm traveling, I always leave it somewhere where somebody else can get it.
Yes, so that is a really smart thing to do, especially reading it is because you're enterprising. The leaving it is because we know that if we leave a newspaper behind, and particularly if we're leaving it like the passengers did on Pullman sleeping cars, that nobody's going to throw it out the window. It's going to be picked up by somebody. And what they didn't know, what those white passengers didn't know, was that the black Pullman porters, who they knew generally nothing about because they never asked, that those Pullman porters were reading it and taking it home and having their kids and grandkids read it. And they didn't know that the books they left behind were getting put to use again in that way. And I think it makes me want to, every time I'm done with a book, leave it somewhere where somebody else is going to pick it up, not put it in bookshelves where it's going to get dusty. And that's
Yes,
the
sir. I have the same mentality. I never try to hoard them. These cities have these the free book box in most places. I love to go
exactly.
and load those book boxes up whenever I can. Keep that tradition going.
It's a good tradition.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Um, let's talk about George Pullman. Let's talk about him, the
Yep.
mastermind behind this whole Pullman Porter thing. So he was definitely a shrewd businessman. And the contradiction, this whole book seems like a big contradiction. Every part of the
Mm.
book, because it seemed as if he gave the most black people jobs at that time, but he was doing it for his own gain in his own way and trying to underpay them every chance he could. And he had a lot of things he's going on. Tell us about George Pullman.
Sure. George Pullman had one major goal in his life, which was to make a huge amount of money. And he failed at a lot of early attempts to do it. He tried moving houses. There was a big industry back then of moving houses. He tried a million ways to make money. And then he decided that if he could give people in an era before airplane travel a comfortable way to travel across country rather than having to sit up day after day in hard benches, if he could give them plush beds, if he could give them great food, as good as hotels and restaurants, then he could charge them a lot of money. And so he built the most elegant accommodations that he could imagine, and he decorated it beautifully, and he had great food on board. But he realized that there was one thing that was missing, and that was having the best service that he could get on this long trip across country. If your pants ripped, if your shirts needed ironing, if you needed somebody to get the mosquitoes out of your sleeping quarters, if you needed anything in the middle of the night, a warmer blanket or a cooler fan or anything you needed, he needed somebody to take care of all those needs and who would do it without questioning and who knew how to take care of people. And he decided in his early days in starting this company that the perfect people to hire were ex slaves who had the equivalent of their PhD in servitude. And they would need jobs, they would need the money that he paid them, but critically, he only paid them about half of what they would need to live well, knowing that if they depended for the other half on tips, they would do anything their passengers asked. So he was a cynical guy. On the other hand, he was, as you say, a contradiction. He gave the men he hired opportunities they had nowhere else, but he did it for his own reasons and his own idea of a way to make money. And so, was he the guy who kept them in a new form of servitude? Yes. Was he the guy who also gave them opportunities nobody else had? Yes.
Yeah.
And he was the right guy, as was Robert Todd Lincoln, once A. Philip Randolph forced them to accept a union, because then the porters got enough money to live on even without their tips. They got much better working conditions, and they got dignity. And it was forced on him, but George Pullman, in the end, understood that he had no choice.
Right. We spoke on embellishing earlier, and it sounds like to me he put certain stories in the press early to get a lot more notoriety. He tried to make things more than what it actually was. They understood the power of words back then. Speak about that a little bit.
Sure. He was a great spin meister. My first book was on a man named Edward Bernays, who was the so called father of public relations. And Edward Bernays was Sigmund Freud's nephew, and he used his uncle's ideas on why people behaved the way they did to try to change their behavior. George Pullman used similar psychology. He got huge publicity for when he made Abe Lincoln's funeral train able to go through. He raised various railroad bridges to make the funeral train be able to go through, and he took what he was able to do with his Pullman trains, and he embellished where necessary to get the kind of publicity he needed, and he wanted to make this a go. And he knew that if he failed in this enterprise of these sleeping cars, it would probably be his last chance. And he didn't fail. He succeeded in a big way, to the point where I wish every time I'm on an Amtrak train that I was on a Pullman sleeping car instead of today's versions of the unkempt and uncomfortable trains that Amtrak runs for us. And they're better than nothing. And I still think riding a train is great. But God, do I wish I'd been able to ride back in those days of the Pullman cars.
Could you describe for the audience a little bit? Like this is really a hotel, 5-star restaurant on wheels. Like
It was.
it really, he did all the bells and whistles. I highly advise going to see the documentary. He showed some of the imagery in the documentary. Man, it's beautiful stuff.
They had menus that were as good as the best restaurants in New York. They had endless offerings. They had white tablecloths and perfect service. Just everything was done. Their beds were comfortable. The porters made up the lower beds and the upper beds to be as comfortable as possible. They had big velvet curtains. It was dark at night. They had a way of lighting it up brilliantly during the day. They had just anything that you would imagine that you could have on the best of an airplane or a train or a bus. The Pullman sleeping cars had, and they had it without question. Every car was as good as the car you had ridden in before. Today, it matters whether you're in an old railroad car or a new one, whether you've got a good conductor or a bad conductor. It just, back then, George Pullman understood that everything had to be up to standards all the time. And so what he did was he sent spies out on his Pullman cars to make sure when the dining car people and the porters and the conductors didn't know they were being spied on, to make sure that everything was done exactly the way the very thick rule book described it should be done. And it was a nasty trick, but it helped make sure that everything was done perfectly.
Well,
And
you had
black,
you know that secret shoppers. You had the secret shoppers.
exactly, he had secret shoppers. And what the job was so good that on the cover of my book, I have a family called Smock, and we have generations of the same family. Fathers would pass the book down to sons. There are four members of the Smock family. Fathers would pass it down to sons, who would pass it down to grandsons, because that was one of the few perks of being a Pullman porter was you got to influence the hiring of other people that you could attest would be good. And who better to attest to than your son or grandson? And so it was a generational thing. It was such a good job that people wanted to pass it down through their own generations.
So let's continue the contradiction. So the Pullman porter himself was a big contradiction. Like on the train, he wearing a nice uniform with the hat and he's doing all this stuff, but he's being demeaned. He's getting called out his name. He's getting treated horribly. They're on the train with all his amenities, but he can't really take advantage of it. They got to sleep on top of tables in the dining car sometimes. They're not sleeping for days. But then they go into the community and they are the superstars in the
Exactly.
community. So there's this, and then you said the money part. They did get homes and everything, but they
Now,
were
there
still
were
getting
huge
treated like
contradictions.
it's weird to describe it.
It was. So on the train, they also had the worst of the jobs. The best jobs were conductors, and black men couldn't be conductors. So they had the worst job on the train and the best job in the community. And it was a series of contradictions. It was like the contradiction of being Satchel Paige. He was the most celebrated guy in black America, and yet he was on the road 300 days of the year, working incredibly hard, pitching just about every night, going from one town to another in a beat up jalopy.
Yeah,
It
sleeping in
was
cars, sleeping in the car.
exactly.
Oh,
So, what happened to the Pullman Porters was their lot in life became dramatically better as soon as they got a union. And what the first thing they did before they got higher wages and before they got better working conditions, it was something you just alluded to. The passengers, racist passengers or ignorant passengers, called them bad names. And the worst name for them was being called George. And that was because there was an old tradition of slaves being named after slave masters. And people were basically saying, we think you're George Pullman slave. And so we don't know your name and we're going to call you this demeaning name of George. And the very first thing that A. Philip Randolph insisted was that Pullman porters get name badges. My name is Sean Polidor, and the knowing that having their name gave them a sense of dignity. If somebody called them George, they would point and say, "No, my name is Sean, and you can call me Mister." And the it gave them a sense of an identity and of belonging, and it was just really important. And that was again a piece of psychology that A. Philip Randolph, the master psychologist, understood, and it was one of the many things that the Porters loved him for.
yeah. Wow. Amazing. Amazing story. Yes, it is. That is incredible. Um, I want to talk a little bit more. So we just said this, right? So the Pullman porters, whenever they're on a train, they had their own little cars. They had to be in their own little dwellings. How did they build their own sense of community and camaraderie amongst each other? How did they build that up? Whenever they
So they
couldn't really be out and about talking, they had to be quiet. They can't talk at night. There's all these restrictions. How did they do it?
they built it up in a couple ways. One was when they were at places when they were at the end of their route and the far end of their route, before they would head back the other way after they had better working conditions, they would have houses and inns and other things where they knew they could stay at. And sometimes the Pullman Company even had them, and they would get to know one another during their downtime. Often they knew all the other Pullman porters in the communities that they lived in. If they lived in Boston, they knew there were 25 other Pullman porters living in town, and they would hang with one another when they were off duty. And quietly in their own areas, where whether it was in the kitchen or in the dining room, um, they would talk to one another. They knew how to do it quietly and often with their own language, the same way that jazz musicians and ball players had a language of their own so that their fans and white passengers wouldn't know what they were talking about. There was a whole language that Pullman porters had, and it was like what parents who speak Italian, who are Italian immigrants, will keep talking to one another in Italian so the kids can't know what they're saying. Kids will talk to one another in Pig Latin so the parents won't know what they're saying. Everybody's got their own language, and the Pullman porters had their own expressions for everything. It was just, they lived as part of this other world of what went on the train, but in their own world. And they were friends. The porters were friends with the dining car waiters, who were friends with the chefs. These were all blacks from a similar world. And after years and decades and sometimes generations of working near one another, they built a camaraderie that was incredibly special.
I'll tell you what, Mr. Larry. I'm a Navy veteran myself, and of course, the Navy vessel is a very small quarters.
Sure.
Our sleeping berthing areas and the hallways itself, the pathways, and it was the same kind of thing. When I'm reading this book, it's reminding me so much of the ways that we found our own little places to be and our own little compartments and our own language and things. So it reminded me so much of you. You kind of innately just do that. You can't even
You do that.
describe how it happens. It just
You
you
do it.
find
And
your way.
you do it especially, as you said, when you're not just living together for 8 hours during a workday, but when you're living together on a ship all the time. You find that way of bonding, and it's a way of building community, of making the job more tolerable and more fun. And it's just what we all naturally do. And the Pullman porters were no different. But George Pullman was also cynical enough. The porters used to say that he was looking for the blackest men with the whitest smiles. And what that meant was he wanted his porters, on the one hand, he wanted them to be tall because they had to reach up to an upper berth, and that made sense. But he also thought that the more black their skin, the more there would be a separation between porter and passenger. All the passengers were white and all the porters were black. And it was like on the plantation in the days of slavery, where the lightest skinned of black slaves would be house slaves, and the darkest would be in the fields. And this was a cynical kind of separation, but it was George Pullman who understood the psychology of racist America, and he was not above playing to that psychology.
Yeah, that's horrible. That's it's crazy to think about that. You know, in present day, it's horrible, man. Ah, one of those things, right? Um, so the Pullman porters in their travels, they had a big old impact on American culture. You mentioned the music earlier. Tell us more about how they impacted American culture with their music, language. We mentioned newspapers, the style of dress, the impact on the porters on the country.
So they had impact by the things that they spread. And that was what we've talked about with newspapers and jazz albums and other things. They had impact in spreading the word of white passengers. And as I said, it could be anything from stock tip to the importance of college education. They listened and they learned about how the people who ran America thought. And that was the captains of finance, the um, old wealth, doctors, lawyers, all these people who rode trains. And they also, when they went back to their hometowns, they brought word about everything from how good life was, maybe in Chicago compared to where they had grown up in Mississippi, what was going on in Mississippi, telling people who were in their world in Chicago. When they walked around their community, one of the guys I interviewed for this book was a congressman who died a few years ago, who I think of as one of the modern day civil rights leaders. John Lewis was his name, and John Lewis, who had an uncle who was a Pullman porter, said that when he was a kid, Pullman porters were these elegant, tall black men who walked around in these beautiful blue uniforms. And just walking into a room, they made people pay attention. And they weren't above wearing their uniforms sometimes when they didn't have to, because they knew it made them look elegant. It's sort of like soldiers who
Like
wear their
military guys.
uniform,
Yeah.
or exactly. And the so they made an impact, and the impact was 99% of the time a positive impact. And people looked at them and said, who are those guys? Or I want to be like those guys, or I want to learn from those guys. And that was changing a culture in a way that really did matter. And it was as instrumental as what ministers or teachers or military people were doing. And the Pullman Porters also had money to spend, and that didn't go without notice. It was not many black women had more opportunities then to do different kinds of work in households and outside of the home. Black men had very few opportunities, and this was work that earned them more money, that earned them prestige, and that wasn't as backbreaking. The real two choices that black men had back then were working in the fields or working in the factory, and both of those were backbreaking work. And while the work of a Pullman porter wasn't easy, it wasn't like
Yes,
bending over all day picking cotton or fruit or whatever you were picking.
yes, sir. Yes, sir. Wow, that's that's incredible. That is incredible. And you mentioned in the book too, like how many books and movies have Pullman Porters in them. Like it was a big deal, like a cultural icon thing to have these guys in these movies and books.
It was the first black men that starred in movies were not Louis Armstrong and Duke Ellington. They were the Pullman Porters who were there in the background. The train was a romantic setting to set novels and to set movies, and the Pullman Porters were part of. If you wanted to immediately tell people about a certain kind of life on the train, all you had to do was show a Pullman Porter in their elegant uniform, and everybody conjured up in their minds the image of George Pullman's sleeping car.
Thank you, thank you. So you're a very unique guest for me. Most times I ask my guests, how would you feel if your book became a movie? Well, you've actually done it. So tell me, how did you feel having the actual Rising from the Rails documentary, and whenever you were doing that process, your
So
involvement in the process?
I loved having the documentary made because the documentary featured real Pullman porters telling their story. The documentary was made early enough that there were enough porters alive to do that. Today, you have to talk about a fictionalized version because there are no porters alive to tell their story. But I hope that there is a famous black actor named Christopher Jackson who was the star of plays ranging from Hamilton to On the Heights. He had a TV show called Bull, and he is working hard now to try to make the Pullman Porter story either into a TV series or a dramatic movie. But if
We
it's
need
not
it.
him, it will be somebody. And their
We need it.
story matters too much and is too romantic not to make it to the big screen someday in the form that they deserve.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. I mentioned at the beginning the Porter series on BET, but unfortunately, they only got one season. Then they cut the funding for it, man. Unfortunately, I really, really, I would have loved more of that series.
Yes. So hopefully someday you and I will live, you more likely than me, but we'll live to
Yeah,
see it make it to TV and to the big screen.
because even within that series, they covered another fascination of mine was the Black Cross nurses. They was the female auxiliary of the Marcus Garvey UNIA movement. So I work in the hospital currently, sir, and I was going around asking all these black nurses, "Have you ever heard of Black Cross nurses?" They look at me
Yeah.
kind of like, "What are you talking about?"
Yeah.
Like nobody I asked ever heard of. It. Nobody.
So there are those buried stories that someday we have to extract and tell. There were stories of the porterettes, the women who worked on the
Yes,
trains,
yes,
and there
sir.
weren't many of them, but
Yes,
there were
sir.
enough, and we've got to go back and tell. And I think women, what I have seen, whether it was in baseball or on the trains or women who were jazz musicians, they had a double stigma of being black and being women. And there was incredible gender bias against them, including by the male Pullman porters, by the male baseball players, and by Ellington, Armstrong, and Basie. They used to call women jazz musicians canaries and thrushes. They were mainly vocalists, and they didn't get the opportunities that the men did. And that was true
Mm.
in the healthcare profession, and it was true on the Pullman trains.
Yes, sir. I interviewed an author last year. She's from this area. She has a book called Riding Jane Crow, and that book is about the
Yeah,
females on the train.
exactly.
Um, the fascinating chapter to me was about whenever the train pulled up to a place, and they had these women in the community come with all this food, and they would bring all these trays of food onto the little docking area, if you will. It was an incredible story.
It is an incredible story, and the only thing more incredible is the women who actually worked on the train and what was it like, as difficult as it was for men in terms of finding a place where they could sleep or get any privacy. It was even worse for the women who were on the trains, but
Mm.
they had incredible stories, and I talked to a few of them, and I wish I had talked to more.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Well, thank you very, very much for your time and your patience. I know you're on tour right now with your brand new
I am.
book, man. Congratulations on everything,
Thank
and
you.
I want to read all of your work. So I'm really, really enjoying your work.
So it's great to be on with you. I appreciate it, Sean.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Bye bye.
Yes, sir.